Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Emma Ellis, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Fayetteville Public Library. Welcome to those watching through live stream as well. This event is part of the True Lit Literary Festival, a collaboration with Fayetteville Public Schools, Fayetteville Public Education Foundation, Walton Arts Center, University of Arkansas Program in Creative Writing and Translation, and Altrusa International of Fayetteville. The festival continues this week, and I hope you'll take a schedule from the back of the room or check out our website and check out our other events. I am delighted to have Sidney Thompson back at the library today. Sidney Thompson teaches creative writing and African American literature at Texas Christian University. He is the author of the award-winning Follow the Angels, Follow the Doves, the Bass Reeves Trilogy, Book 1, and Hell on the Border, the Bass Reeves Trilogy, Book 2, adapted for the Paramount Plus miniseries Lawmen Bass Reeves, directed by Taylor Sheridan and starring David Oyelowo. Thompson holds a PhD in American Literature and African American Narratives from the University of North Texas and an MFA in Creative Writing from the University of Arkansas. Please help me welcome Sidney Thompson.
Thanks for the yoo-hoo. Pig suey. All right. Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here. Always happy to return to my roots of Arkansas. And that's probably what drew me in part to the story of Bass Reeves. I have a couple of pictures up here in case you're not familiar with who Bass Reeves is. This one on the left was taken approximately around the time he was hired as a deputy out of Judge Parker's court in Fort Smith. And that was in 1875. He was born in 1838, died in 1910. And I have a quote underneath him here on the left from Morgan Freeman. And he says, "You ain't hear a lot of stuff about Bass Reeves. Nobody's ever tackled him. He was one of the most well-known deputy marshals in the West in his time. I want to do Bass Reeves." It was something about the way he slipped into character. You ain't hear a lot of stuff about Bass Reeves. That it just pulled me in too. And when he said, "I want to do Bass Reeves," I thought, me too. I was sitting at home watching him. He was being interviewed on CNN. He was promoting his latest film. This was back in 2010. And at the end of the interview, he was asked, "What would your dream role be?" And this is when he said this. And I love Morgan Freeman. I've always followed his career from the beginning. And I was curious how he knew about this person that no one knew anything about. And he was begging for a story, somebody to write his life story. Being a writer, not an historian, but a storyteller, I wanted to learn who he was. A little online sleuthing led me to a really good book. And I really thought at the time, just really one quality book. It was a book of nonfiction by Art Burton called Black Gun, Silver Star, by African-American Oklahoma historian who grew up hearing stories, legends about Bass Reeves and decided to learn more about him. Bass Reeves was whitewashed from our history for over 100 years. Art Burton brought him back to life, enough for Morgan Freeman to speak out and enough for me to want to do my part in preserving his history in the only way I could as a story writer. So I researched the history as much as possible, had to decide what I had to keep, what I had to include in the story, what were the most important elements that I thought in his life. There were gaps in the story, and so what I knew kind of informed my imagination on what I needed to create to explain what we knew. So what you see on the right over here is at the end of his career. He's in Muskogee. So he worked 30 years for the federal court in Fort Smith, Arkansas, for the Western District of Arkansas. And then when Oklahoma became a state, he lost his job, that federal deputy job, because now Indian Territory was a state. So he became a policeman for the Muskogee Police Department. He was a beat cop, and he walked his beat in the Negro District, downtown area, near the train stations and the shops. And that's him on the far left on the bottom holding the cane. He was a handsome man, a strong man, taller than most at his time, 6'2". He was ambidextrous with a pistol and shotgun, rifle. A lawman for 32 years, and yet only wounded once, as far as we can tell from the records, and hence the cane. He was shot in his left thigh in the 1890s in a close quarter shootout, and he was in many close quarter shootouts and avoided many scrapes because of how innovative he was. And I do want to read an excerpt from my new book, the third book that closes out the trilogy of his life. I wanted to try to capture his entire life. So book 1, Follow the Angels, Follow the Doves, covers from birth to the Civil War, when he's in his 20s. The second book, Hell on the Border, covers, it picks up later when he's at the peak of his career in the 1880s as a U.S. Deputy Marshal. And then the third book covers the tail end of his deputy career and the end of his life in terms of the turmoil in his family and his health. So I separated his story out into 3 books to make some sense of the narrative. He had a long, sprawling life, and I thought it would be easier to tell it that way, since he naturally seemed to have several climaxes. And so I use those as the kind of the cliffhangers for each one. So the third book, I didn't give you the title of that, is The Forsaken and the Dead. And this scene takes place in 1895. It's based on records that we have, newspaper stories, court testimony, because it involves the last man that was hanged in the federal court in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And you'll see that there's a unique quality in this excerpt in terms of what Bass Reeves does as a deputy marshal in the 19th century. He's more of a detective at times. And he was really observant about details, forensic details, that were ahead of his time, certainly on the frontier. So I'm going to read the short opening chapter of the third book, and it's called Thatch. Indian Territory was in a dry season in May of 1895, leaving Rock Creek in the Creek Nation especially shallow in its broad bed, the water steepled with rocks where turtles sunned. The 3 buzzards that the 3 men had waved away from the bank floated directly above them as if the men's halos had loosed from their moorings from transpiration, and in their haste to rise heavenward had collided to form a circling chain that bound these chance souls to this moment and place, their lives to their inevitable long home, starting now. He was there, face down in it. The white man who had introduced himself as Lee nearly 2 hours earlier in Keokuk Falls pointed with a thrusting action of his rigid coat sleeve to help Bass sight the spot. Where it's smooth there, betwixt the froth and them 2 chicken turtles stacked, that's where I drug 'em up from to keep 'em from drifting. He spat the color of wet rocks and let his arm hang at his side. He weren't that heavy. He might look big, but really ain't. Bass let his chin drop, and he eyed the clothed hump, buzzing with flies. It was crisscrossed with ropes that were tied to tree branches and rocks. Eddie Reed, a young deputy Bass was mentoring, wore his neckerchief bandit-like as he stood on the slope of the bank at an angle near the water's edge. He checked the dead man's pockets, but a wadded handkerchief was all he found. He smelled better this morning, Lee offered. I reckon so, Bass said. The buzzards had flayed the back of the man's head, ears, and neck. Surprisingly, there were no signs the buzzards had pecked his hands, despite the exposed flesh of 2 missing fingers, severed at the second joint on his right hand. The man's skin had begun to marble pink and white all over. He looked to be a white man. Bass strained to bend down but hesitated from the sting in his thigh. Want 'em rolled over? Eddie asked, standing over the dead man's feet. A sock still remained where one of his boots was missing. It was a rich man's sock. Bass nodded, sure could use the help today. He took hold of one of the ropes that wrapped around the man's back and tugged, testing if the rope was taut enough. It was. Come on, he said, and he and Eddie rolled the man over. The center of the man's forehead was both concave and swollen, imprinted with a fist-shaped blow, and purple-black with a gash across the top that had long stopped bleeding and opened to redness. The skin around the gash, among the whiskers on his face and down on his neck, seemed to slide away like wet paper. Bass shifted his eyes to Lee, who was hitching up his trousers, but Lee's gut instantly weighed them down again. You positive this Thatch? Bass asked. Up on his toes, Lee leaned over the body, then rocked back on his heels. That's who he told me last night he was. He spat and wiped his chin and beard on his sleeve. I was setting my traps when I come up on him in the evening time. He was stirring up something to eat for him and some sidekicker he had with him, and he saved for me to join them. He introduced himself as Zachariah Thatch from Washington County, and the one who ain't here was Jimmy Cash or something. From Arkansas too, but from Faulkner County, he say. If Thatch was the one cooking, Bass said, what makes you think the one with him was working for him and not the other way? Lee hunched his shoulders. I don't know. 'Cause Thatch was twice as old as him and dressed and talked like he had money. I mean, Thatch was white while the younger one, Jimmy, sure wasn't. I mean, he was white looking but mixed with dark. What kind of dark, I couldn't tell you. And while Thatch talked big about inspecting some land about to open for settlement in the Kickapoos, Jimmy was quiet on it. Of course, I got family in Washington County, so me and this dead man here did most of the talking about some apple growers we knowed in Georgetown. I guess you know it by Lincoln. Bass gazed blankly. Know it by the apples. Best anywheres, Lee said. Bass nodded. Anything else you recall? Lee's eyes seemed to fix on the handkerchief wad on a patch of grass. His friends say he just got back from Keokuk Falls. His head was bobbing like a cork, he was so sour, while this one here didn't act like he drank a drop. Didn't smell like he did, anyhow. Eddie took a step closer as if to join the conversation, but Bass had never known him to be much of a talker in the company of others. Which saloon did he say? Bass asked. Red Dog. He talked about a shooting there, that a man died dueling a colored lawman. He was laughing about it. Bass turned to Thatch and studied his milky, bloodshot eyes. He eased down on the good knee and waved flies away with his hat, then pressed his fingertips against the man's forehead, around the gash, feeling the give and listening to the bits of skull crackle. That was in the evening you saw him, you say? That's right, Lee said, as Bass lifted a branch off of Thatch's chest to look for holes in his clothes. Weren't dark yet, but getting there. 2 shots I heard come later. I was in my own camp by then. Bass tipped one of the rocks on its side as if he were hunting underneath for worms in the man's heart. Like pow pow, he asked. No, Lee said. Like pow. Pow. Like enough time for a bad shot to jump up closer, you know. Bass lowered the rock back down, and with his Sheffield Bowie knife, he began cutting rope. Eddie freed the weights from the rope and tossed them aside. A rock tumbled into the water while Bass unbuttoned the man's shirt. Not until Bass had unfastened the man's trousers did he find what appeared to be a 38 entry hole, like a new navel, a few inches below his original one. Bass squinted up at the dark silhouette of Lee's head, like a hole itself in that sunny sky. The buzzards so slow around that hole to almost be flies crawling. Guessing you was that colored lawman, Lee said. Bass nodded. I ain't the white one that died. But he got you, I see. Bass shut his eyes and took a deep breath despite what the air over this decaying dead man smelt like. Getting shot for the first time in his life was not something he was proud of. He took up his knife. God allows the devil to have his luck. Lee chuckled. The other one drawed first, didn't he? Don't that make you the lucky one? Bass rested the point of the 6-inch blade on Thatch's entry wound. Fear will make a body move quick. Sure true. He pressed the blade down and wiggled it back and forth as it sank, and as he felt for the slug in that bloated belly flesh, soft as curd. But quick ain't the whole of it, you know, Bass said. I tried to warn the boy. Sure, he was real fast, just like he said. But like a lot of 'em, he couldn't shoot both fast and straight. Once the blade disappeared up to the brass crossguard, Bass eased up on the pressure, and the blade rose back out almost on its own accord. Then he tried again by going perpendicular to the previous puncture mark. Jesus, Lee said, you gotta have it? Maybe not, Bass said, but I want it. He wiggled the knife back and forth again as he continued to press it down deep, still not feeling that hard button of lead, so he pulled the blade out just a little until he had good leverage with it, then pried the belly fat out of the body, spilling it in chunks like congealed flour of head cheese. He laid the knife on the ground beside him and searched through the fat with his fingers until he found it, a 38 slug of lead the size of a pearl. He reached for his knife, stood upright, and limped to the water's edge to rinse his hands, knife, and the bullet that might or might not prove that the young man Zachariah Thatch had invited to accompany him on his travels had murdered him in cold blood. Pow! Thatch hadn't seen it coming. With no time to reach for a weapon, he could only throw up his hands to shield himself. Maybe that was how it happened. First losing the 2 middle fingers on his right hand, but there was no telling where the slug went. Then came the second pow, once the shooter had moved closer to his target, this one striking Thatch in the gut to slow him even more, so that either Jimmy Cash or someone else with high nerves or a poor aim could finally step all the way up to him, right to his head, and finish him off with something as solid as it was blunt. Bass stared at the water, clear as glass at the surface but golden as a picture frame at the bottom, then at the belly slime stringing away from his hands like some enormous spider web that fell apart as the wind blew. Can you point out where they camped? Lee didn't say a word. He spat as if that were enough of an answer, and indeed it was. When Bass heard him step away, he knew to push on up to begin loading the corpse into the wagon so he and Eddie could follow. And I'll stop there. This little mystery continues on, and as I alluded to before, that's the injury that led to his needing to carry a cane, because the bullet that struck him couldn't be retrieved. The doctor couldn't get it; thought it was too unsafe, so it was always in there, embedded in him. So that's kind of good to know, because we're starting to think we know approximately where he's buried, and that could help us identify him. 1838 to 1910, this country changed a lot over the course of his life, and it was fun to learn about our nation as I learned about Bass Reeves and writing this trilogy. I'll pause and ask, I feel like I've been talking a while, and I'll take a sip of water. Is there anything that you might want to know more about? Either the TV show that was based on this, or about my origins, or anything at all about Bass Reeves that comes to mind? Yes, sir.
Where was he born? How did we get to Judge Parker's service?
Okay, so he was born on a plantation not far from here, right outside of Van Buren, which is right outside of Fort Smith, which isn't too far from here. He was born to William Steele Reeves, a prominent planner, prominent politician in Tennessee politics before he moved to Arkansas and got involved in Arkansas state politics. As I narrate in my books, Bass Reeves is eventually given to his son. William gives Bass Reeves to his son to attend him to the Civil War. His son, George Reeves, was a Texas cavalry officer, and he took Bass Reeves with him to fight on the Western Front in Arkansas, Missouri, and it's in that terrain where the first book concludes. George Reeves was very different from what I could discern from the original owner, William, his father, William Reeves. William Reeves was described by people as being very friendly, and Bass Reeves thought of him as a father. And that would explain why he didn't try to escape earlier. He kind of bides his time, but when he's under the thumb of George Reeves, who had a history of being insubordinate and drunken as an officer. So when I saw those records of his service, I thought I could figure out his thinking, and I could wrap my head around the character I needed for the book. Because just imagine, at that time, someone like George Reeves traveling with an enslaved man that you might mistreat, bully, try to intimidate, which the Civil War service kind of told me that this is somebody who seems awfully insecure. Certainly couldn't control his emotions. And just to give you a little background on one reason why I depicted the character I do, George Reeves, as a prominent character in my books. I presented him as an intellectual because his father was wealthy, and in that wealth, with that luxury time, I wanted him to be well read, and I thought, what would be his advantage in terms of being able to control Bass Reeves? I thought he would probably he couldn't fall back on his size or his strength. He would fall back on his knowledge. And he would try to intimidate him intellectually. And so once I kind of came up with that, it really helped me to see how to write the first book. And it's largely, in that book, a relationship between Bass Reeves and his master and George. And that kind of covers what I didn't include there is George lived in North Texas, not far from Paris, Texas. So right before right before the Civil War breaks out, he's given away to his son who lives in Texas. So he moves from Arkansas to Texas, and I wanted to try to render that rupture in his life of not just losing the master that he grew to love, but losing the area, the terrain, and shifting to somebody else, being under George Reeves, and in Texas, a more desolate climate. I thought that would better kind of help us understand his mindset, his psyche, as to why he starts to plot an escape. And if you know anything about Bass Reeves, the historic figure does escape. And so the first book leads up to that. The second book and the third books are about later in his career. And what a life. I mean, have you heard about the Lone Ranger connection by chance? Anyone? I often see these memes or posts on Facebook and social media about the real Lone Ranger was a black man, Bass Reeves, and we don't know for sure, honestly. I hate to jump to the conclusion to say definitively that he was the Lone Ranger, like that we know for sure that the creators of the radio character or Zane Grey's character of the Ranger himself, did they steal the story of Bass Reeves for those characters? I'm not willing to say that, but it's likely. The similarities are pretty incredible. Bass Reeves did live among the Native Americans. As I depicted here in this opening chapter, he has a part Native American possuman, Edwin Reed, Belle Starr's son. Belle Starr, the infamous female outlaw who lived in Indian Territory. And Edwin Reed was an outlaw himself, and he tried to turn his life around, and Judge Isaac Parker believed that he could turn himself around if he was tutored or mentored by a good man. And so he assigned Edwin Reed to Bass Reeves. So he had his Native American sidekick, so to speak. He has his disguise. I mean, his black skin is his natural disguise. He often used it because most people at that time didn't expect a lawman to be black. He would also add to that some disguises, dress up like a cowboy or a tramp. One time, it's reported that he dressed like a woman. So, very creative sort who was always trying to avoid bloodshed if at all possible, partly because he was a man of faith and he believed in the law too, that, people were innocent until proven guilty. He didn't want to assume too much. He would defend himself if he had to, but he preferred to resort to violence only in self-defense, which is a lot like the Lone Ranger code. He, like Lee helps him in that scene I was reading. In the next chapter, he gives him a silver dollar as a tip. Bass Reeves commonly did that. So that was his trademark, a silver dollar. Are we reading too much into this? The silver bullet, silver dollar. I don't know. All I can say is legend surrounded Bass Reeves' entire life. He was an enigmatic character. It was hard to really fathom who he was because he did work in disguise so much of the time. And he even reported lies sometimes to the newspapers to cover his tracks, because I think he knew that there would come a day when people might start questioning and doubting African American lawmen, and he thought too much publicity might hurt him. Maybe only so many white men he could capture and kill before they might decide, hey, you can't do that anymore. So he didn't want to kill them for good reasons, his faith, and it just the practical aspect of why put myself in danger? I mean, shootouts that threatens everybody. So he was just a smart individual, calm under pressure. And if anybody has ever been the Lone Ranger, or could be, he certainly was it. I think Bass Reeves is the closest person that I know of to match the Lone Ranger, the fictional Lone Ranger. So if that helps people understand who Bass Reeves was, to think in terms of the Lone Ranger, I'm fine with that. I think it's possible. I think it's certainly possible there's a link. Thank you for that question. I gave you a long answer and added to it. As I think of things I haven't mentioned before, but did you have a question? I have not seen anything. Why do you ask about George Washington Carver? Did George Washington Carver and Bass Reeves ever meet? That's fascinating.
That dawned on me, and I was like, man, with both of their strong faith, that would have just been amazing.
Right. I like that. And that's a great question. I don't know if they met. I do know, like, the most famous person that he met was Theodore Roosevelt. And when Theodore Roosevelt, he rode on a train through Indian Territory a couple of years before it became a state, and he wanted to assure the people that he would do all he could to make it a state. And he stopped along the way in numerous places, Muskogee being one of them. And that's where Bass was a policeman. And we know that a Washington newspaper from Washington, D.C., when they published Bass Reeves' obituary in 1910, telling about his life, they acknowledged that he was a Secret Service serviceman, and the only time that would have even been possible was when Theodore Roosevelt went through there. So you have to draw some facts, you have to draw some conclusions. It's like, do we We don't have a picture of him standing next to Theodore Roosevelt. But that's the only way it would make sense that he was hired, and that all of the best deputies, and maybe all the deputies would have helped out anyway on that. So that's not a long shot, Anyway, but anyway, right? I love that question. And another question that I asked, I wondered, so Geronimo was a prisoner of war in Fort Sill, in not far from Bass's jurisdiction in Indian Territory. Surely he would have been interested to meet him, and would have been allowed to. So that's one thing that I enjoyed. As a writer, you have to fill in gaps. So there are a couple of places where I needed to fill in gaps in this last book, and I enjoyed imagining an encounter, how such an encounter could have happened between Geronimo and Bass Reeves, and it's really likely. I don't want to give anything away how it could have happened, but anyway, the information is in there. Any other questions? Nothing's crazy. Every question's great. What did he do? Well,
What did he do did it say anything about what he did to relax?
when he lived in Fort Smith at the peak of his career, and he was wealthy because he spent so much of his time working, really not enough at home. But he did have a nice little farm right in town, and he had a garden and horses, and supposedly he farmed, and that was before he was bankrupted because he was charged with murder in a controversial case. And that's described, the events that lead up to that in the second story, my second book, Hell on the Border. Hell on the Border is the nickname for the federal jail in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And so Bass either inadvertently or purposefully shot someone in his outfit, in his cook. That's historically, that's history, and that leads to a trial. You can draw some conclusions that he returns to being a lawman, and he was a lawman with 10, later 11, much of his life, 10 children, and then he does remarry and adds another. So he was busy. He had to make money. And when he went out to round up outlaws in Indian Territory, he didn't want to return until he'd filled up his wagon, until he'd gathered up as many outlaws as possible to make as much money as possible to justify him being away from his family. And so at that day, he's not just being paid a salary as a lawman. He makes his money on the bounties of the men he captures or kills. So he wanted to make the best use of his time. So he was away from his family. Up to every time he went out into the Indian Territory, he was gone for on average a month. So he wasn't at home, which explains why several of his children got into trouble and broke the law. And I tackle that in the third book because, there are some difficult crimes that his children committed. And it seemed like there was always a challenge. Either he's being doubted, he's being persecuted, discriminated against, or, like as an enslaved person, he has these accomplishments, but people in authority sometimes don't want to trust him, and looked like at times they want to push him out of his work. And if it weren't for Judge Isaac Parker for being such a fair man, he probably wouldn't have stayed in that position as long as he did. But Judge Isaac Parker really admired Bass Reeves, and he was an important man to have his back. Judge Isaac Parker was the authority in that area. So even though there might have been a marshal or a commissioner that didn't like him, who was racist and didn't like blacks as deputies, Judge Isaac Parker was able to defend him and support Bass Reeves through the years, through some controversies. But he dies in 1910 of Bright's disease. So when you asked about what was he doing at the end of his life, he's living in an apartment, in a boarding house, in Muskogee. He's just walking his beat, living with his wife and children, not doing much else that we can tell. He seems like he's always on the ready, and when another lawman needed help, there were accounts from fellow lawmen that when Ledbetter needed help, a lawman, hey, go get Bass Reeves. He's a great marksman. He might be able to help us get this outlaw who's in this ravine, and we can't seem to get him. Maybe that Bass Reeves as a sniper can get him, because he's shooting at us and he's trying to get away, and we don't want him to get away. But so like his friends look to him for help. It's almost like, somebody get the Lone Ranger. We need help. And he would ride in. I mean, there are just ominous similarities between the fictional legend and the historic legend.
With your studies of him, and now you may have to put this in your own words and fill in those blanks that you're talking about. Is there some bit of advice or some event that impacted the rest of his life that you could possibly share with us?
Events that
Either events or some advice that he got from his something like that.
Yeah, we don't know anything about his father. In terms of advice, trying to think. His mother was an important influence as a religious woman, and she didn't like, when he was a child, that he would like to pretend to be an outlaw. And he would sing songs about outlaws. And he was always going around shooting somebody. And it worried her. It worried her. And so maybe, I would say mom may have been the most important influence. Like early on, you don't want to be the bad guy. That might seem glamorous. But her faith rubbed off on him for sure. He didn't know his father. I'm sure the father was stripped away, as often was the case during times of slavery. You remove the children from the parents as often as you can to try to break their spirit and feel like there's less of a support network. You just have to work, and you just listen to the slave owners and the overseers, not dad. But he did get to live closely with his grandparents, his grandmother, grandfather. His grandfather was well respected by his first master, William S. Reeves. So much so that he gave Bass's grandfather the name Bass Reeves. He was called Bass. He already had that name, but he was given the last name Reeves as an honor of respect, and allowed to have his own cabin, not live in the slave quarters. So he had his own cabin for him and his wife, and he was allowed that privilege to have his wife in the cabin with him, which is kind of unusual. So old Bass has young Bass as his grandson. So young Bass grows up with his grandparents, grows up with his mom, grows up with an aunt. His mom was the mistress's primary, keeper, and the aunt was a prominent person on the plantation as well as a seamstress. So the fact that he has a grandparent, an aunt, and a mom who were treated better than the other enslaved individuals on the plantation probably accounts for why Bass Reeves gained the type of agency that he thought he could have the privilege one day of being special, that he could have a special title. Maybe not just being the bad guy, the outlaw. Hey, how about the good guy, the lawman? I think his mom played an important role. She ended up living with his family, so she was an influence for the rest of his life. She lived with him. So I would give mom certainly the credit there in Fort Smith until he has to sell his home to cover his attorney fees for a murder trial. That's what kind of bankrupted him. He wanted to make sure he could escape jail, the gallows, and he wanted to defend himself with the best people he could hire. And you know what he did? He hired them all. That shows you how smart he was. Bass Reeves hired every good lawyer he could find so that the court had no good lawyer to prosecute him. He thought, I guess that's why the good Lord blessed me with all this money. It's a fascinating story. He rises and then he falls, and he rises and he falls, and a very resilient man who learns lessons. He's got flaws, like all of us. I didn't want to paint him like a perfect character, and I think too many people want to think of him that way. Lone Ranger, he's perfect. He's not perfect, but he's awfully good, and his intentions are good, and I think he's a great role model. He's been my role model for the last 12 years as a have been writing this trilogy. That's how long it took me to figure out how to write this story. And just living with that man in my head, in my imagination for that long, I feel like now he's my good angel. He's my conscience. Hey, Sidney, calm down, relax. You can figure it out. Trust yourself. You can find a way out of this. Be calm. Have faith. He was able to find a way to escape danger at every turn in his life. That's an amazing lesson. And I wanted to emphasize that through these books. Yeah.
Did he attend social events in Fort Worth, or was he kind of shunned by them by that color?
In Fort Smith?
In Fort
No, yeah. So did he attend events in Fort Smith? I mean, he was a prominent individual in Fort Smith. From 1875, when his career started, to 1883, there's an incident with the shooting of his cook. And there are different accounts of that. There are different accounts. And if you read my book, you may wonder, why does he go this direction? I thought I heard this. You may have heard one version, maybe you've heard two versions. But there are different accounts as to what happened. And I go with what I think probably happened, the likelihood. Not what makes him necessarily look the best, because I didn't think my goal was propaganda. I wanted to try to tell as honest a story as I could. So when that event happens, some people turn. Some people trust that it was an accident when he kills his cook. Some people think that he's guilty of murder, or maybe it's manslaughter. We're not sure. There was a lot of controversy swirling around it for a couple of years, so people weren't sure. So he was a man respected by most, though, for most of his career, and when he left the court in 98, Judge Isaac Parker retires, and he moves to Paris, Texas, to work in the Eastern District of Texas for a little bit before he moves to Muskogee. But he's often respected, and I've recently learned, this is new information, that the Houston Police Department was well aware of his skills of undercover and, his ability to just blend in, befriend outlaws, and trick them. He was a trickster for sure. And they hired him to come down to Houston. They had someone in the jail that they were sure was guilty of murder. And they asked him, would you? So he pretended to be, arrested, thrown in the slammer too. And he finds a way to cozy up with this guy in there and gets a confession out of him. So, there's so many accounts that just keep supporting the idea of how respected he was, how smart he was. It's really an American tale. I think he was the most important frontier hero we have. He deserves to be up there. I'm not going to say before or ahead of or whatever, but we know the names of Wyatt Earp and Billy the Kid and So many others, Jesse James, so many notorious people. This name should be household. This should be a household name, Bass Reeves, for the good that he did, and not just glamorize the blood. I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming and listening to me talk about this important historical figure, Bass Reeves. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.